considering the week that has just been since Russia actually moved to invade Ukraine. So much has changed about so many countries. Perhaps we should consider Russia first of all. This is a bold move in the face of kind of Western diplomacy in the weeks beforehand, and indeed in the days since the invasion. Western countries, the NATO alliance, kind of really pushing back on Russia. What have we learned about Russia in the last week or so?
First of all, we've learned just how risk tolerant Vladimir Putin is. Some of the costs that Russia is incurring economically and otherwise were not only foreseeable before the invasion, they were threatened, they were telegraphed. And he did this anyway. And he also seemed to think that there may be a kind of lightning strike and the government in Kiev would flee and he could put a puppet government in that would be friendlier to Russia. And of course, so far, it's been more of a difficult situation for the Russians than I believe the Russians themselves anticipated. And he was willing to run really big risks economically, militarily, certainly diplomatically, for something that I suspect the average Russian wouldn't think is a tremendous gain, which is a friendly government on the top of Kiev. And yet he did it. And that tells you something about his worldview, his mentality, and his appetite for risk.
What can we understand then about Western leaders who, of course, in the build-up to this invasion, we're almost lining up to go and visit President Putin, or at least to have some sort of level of diplomatic engagement with him. Was that all for nothing? Have we learned anything about Western leaders in that context?
Well, it was for nothing in the sense that there was not a diplomatic agreement that could forestall the war, and there may never have been one. But it did something else. The effort to try, I think, galvanize the minds of those Western leaders. And then, frankly, the deception that the Russians engaged in during that process, I think, stiffened the spines of them in the aftermath. The French as a perfect example of where President Macron spent lots of time and went to Moscow and spent time on the phone with Putin trying to talk about the Minsk protocol implementation and things like that. And of course, Putin was planning his invasion the entire time, did it. And the French subsequently said, well, this was deception. So the fact that the trust was completely broken meant that I think the Europeans, one of the reasons why the Europeans have taken steps, for example, on sanctions that they otherwise may not have taken had that gone down a different way.
I suppose then, with all of that in mind, it's worth considering what we have not seen in the last few days, and that is a kind of lack of involvement from China, for example, as one example, and also the kind of end of neutrality in some contexts, which you've written about as well, from countries like Sweden and Finland as well, I think.
Yes, on the neutrality side, Sweden is working ever more closely with NATO. Now it is openly discussed about potential Swedish membership in NATO. Finland, which of course has never been a member of NATO either, today or yesterday, a new poll came out, and for the first time ever, a majority of Finns say that their country should join NATO. It's being discussed in the Finnish parliament. That again is being talked about openly. It's being talked about so seriously that the Russian Foreign Ministry preemptively issued a threat if they were to join NATO. The Swiss, the Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, it's only been neutral since the 1500s, but that's a pretty good run. And the Swiss came out and, to everyone's surprise, adopted the EU sanctions, including the freezing of Russian assets, and which is hardly a bystander kind of action to take on. The biggest outlier here is, as you said, is China, and China's gotten itself into a big jam because just a few weeks before the Russian invasion, Xi Jinping met with Vladimir Putin. They talked about how they were going to have a partnership that would be ever closer and without limits. They put out a big manifesto about how both countries were going to help each other sort of arrive at their correct and appropriate station in the world. They were going to impose essentially US-led international system, and Putin's acted on that. And now the Chinese, on the one hand, see what this looks like, but on the other hand, have tied themselves to a country that is being isolated, will be impoverished, and for which there is no trust in the rest of the world. And so that's put the Chinese quite out on a limb here, and they're trying to walk some sort of delicate balance here, but without any success.
With all that in mind, then, and I appreciate that this invasion is only a week old, a week too old indeed, but a week old nonetheless. Is it possible to assess whether these changes, whether these quite dramatic shifts in policies of so many countries, whether they are here to stay, whether this has really reframed the kind of global security situation?
I think it has to a significant degree, and especially in Europe, but not exclusively in Europe. I mean, Germany is perhaps the poster child for this because, for decades, the German embrace of post-war pacifism and low defense budgets and things like that have been a source of haranguing from American presidents and either from other Europeans saying, you're the biggest country in Europe, you need to take more responsibility for security matters and things like that. Well, Putin accomplished in a weekend what decades of haranguing of the Germans did not. And the German chancellor, the new German chancellor himself said, this is a watershed moment. This day will be remembered, and immediately announced a huge increase in the defense budget, that Germany is going to become strong, that it's going to take more responsibility for security matters and things like that. And I think, even if somehow this war were to end tomorrow, which I don't think it will, unfortunately, I think this is going to result in a shift in the way Germany discerns its interests and how it should act on them. So that's an example of the kind of thing that I think will happen. And of course, all of the sanctions that have been put in place, including from countries outside of Europe, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Australia, those aren't going anywhere. And that, again, has been a pretty watershed moment to sanction a country as large as Russia, with an economy as large as Russia, in a way that is severe as what we've seen in the past couple of days.
It's really fascinating. Is the only way out of this to somehow get rid of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by out of this. I mean, there's a way out of the war itself, which is for the Russians to find themselves unsuccessful. And Putin could be in charge. I think that it's very hard to say what the stability is of the Putin regime in Russia. These governments tend to be a bit like hollow trees when they have an autocratic leader who's been around for a long time, which they look solid on the outside, and then maybe one moment they give way, but they may not. I don't think that we should proceed by any measure believing that Putin will not be the president of Russia into the indefinite future. But the fact that he is means that Russia's likely to be subject to this very deep isolation, economic penalties, and really efforts to weaken Russia as a nation state because of fears about what it would do with its power if it was not.
And is that about, I suppose, in some way, trying to coax the hierarchy of Russia, and indeed the people of Russia, and to an extent here, the army of Russia, to kind of turn against Putin themselves? Is that the way that change will happen in Russia, is kind of from within with pressure from outside?
Well, I think there's multiple motivations behind the pressure that has been in place so far, and some of this depends who you ask. I mean, no longer is it the case, as it was before the invasion, that the notion is to threaten these sanctions and other forms of pressure that Putin might say, hey, the costs are going to outweigh the benefits. I won't do this in the first place. That day has passed, obviously. Deterrence did not work. But, for example, the British, by going after particular oligarchs and property in London and things like that, I think would like to demonstrate to people in the circles around Putin that this kind of unwarranted, unprovoked aggression has a very significant cost, including to them personally, and that they should stop it, or they should do a hell of a lot less of it. Even there, though, it's hard to know exactly what the mechanism by which that influences Russian policy, which is why you get to sort of the underlying fallback rationale for this pressure, which is, if we just assume that Russia under Vladimir Putin is going to be an aggressive, risk-tolerant, revisionist state, discontented with its place in Europe and in the world and willing to take dangerous actions to change it, then we want it to be less capable of taking those actions than it would be otherwise. And a lot of the sanctions and the export controls and things like that over time, and I'm meaning years, would have the effect of weakening the Russian ability to project power, even if its policy and its intent remains exactly the same.
What does, just as a final consideration, what does engagement in this war look like on the part of NATO and the US and the UK and the countries we've mentioned, the EU as well, which had already quite an active role? Once sanctions have been ramped up, as they already have been to a great extent, and indeed, is there a finite point at which sanctions will end? And then what does engagement look like? Are there options here? Have we still got a ways to go in terms of trying to get Russia and Putin to back down?
There are, yeah. I mean, I was speaking with some sanctions experts this morning and said, if you sort of envision that the sanctions that were put on Iran over the years are sort of level 10, we're at about level 7 with Russia. So that still gives you other things that could be done. There's been no energy sanctions specifically, and some of the SWIFT sanctions and things have not been categorical. And so, yes, there is more that could be done on sanctions. But that said, there's not much optimism that those would induce Putin to back down in a way that he hasn't so far. But nevertheless, there's room to do more if governments involved decide that it's worth doing more. The other part beyond the sanctions is the weapons and the support to Ukrainians who are fighting off the Russians. And even if the Russians are able to, through brutality and attacks on civilians and just sheer numbers and scale, overwhelm the conventional capabilities of the Ukrainian military and take Kiev and things like that, I think they're looking at a long-term insurgency that will be aided by Europe and NATO and the EU and the United States. And so this is kind of the overarching question mark of, what's the end game in Putin's mind here? Either they wanted quick regime change. Well, let's say that, God forbid, they get regime change on a longer time frame. Either they occupy the country with Russian troops indefinitely, in which case they elicit an insurgency to fight them out, or they go home and don't occupy the country, in which case you get a popular uprising against the government you just put in place. And either way, you've got yourself a big problem. And no one can quite game out exactly how this is supposed to go. And people said, well, maybe Putin's got some ace up his sleeve that no one's thought of. But seeing the way the war has gone thus far, my suspicion now is he in fact does not, which means that engagement from the West could be indefinite in terms of duration, irrespective of the terrible things we're seeing on our screen right now.
Richard, thank you very much. That's perfect.